Imagine a library so vast it took 3 whole months to burn to the ground, its smoke blackening the sky for weeks. Picture learning about steam engines, not from James Watt, but from an ancient Greek inventor whose blueprints vanished in a legendary library fire. Think about this. For every one ancient Greek play we can read today, like those by Sophocles or Euripides, there were at least 9 others that are now just titles. Their stories and wisdom lost forever, possibly. And brace yourself for this. Entire civilizations had their histories, their scientific breakthroughs, and their deeply held beliefs systematically erased when invaders decided their books were too dangerous or just plain wrong. Get ready to explore some of the most mind-blowing losses of knowledge in human history. These aren't just dusty old buildings. They were treasure troves of thought, invention, and art that, had they survived, could have sent our world down a completely different path. Number 7. The Library of Ashurbanipal, where history itself was written down, and then buried for Gania. Picture this. It's way back, like 2,600 years ago, in a city called Nineveh. This was the capital of the massive Neo-Assyrian Empire, a real powerhouse in the ancient Middle East. And its king, Ashurbanipal, wasn't just your average run-of-the-mill conqueror. Sure, he was tough, but he was also a scholar, a collector, a guy who genuinely loved knowledge. He bragged about being able to read complex cuneiform script, those cool wedge-shaped symbols pressed into clay tablets, which was like being a super nerd back then. So, what did this brainy king do? He decided to create one of the world's first truly systematic libraries. He sent his scribes all over Mesopotamia, a land that includes modern-day Iraq, to gather up every important text they could find. They copied ancient Sumerian and Babylonian myths, religious rituals, medical texts, dictionaries, folk tales, scientific observations, and even letters and government records, talking thousands upon thousands of clay tablets. It wasn't a library of delicate scrolls, it was a library of baked earth, designed to last. One of the most famous finds from Ashurbanipal's library, rediscovered by archaeologists in the 1800s, is the most complete version we have of the Epic of Gilgamesh. You know that incredible story about a hero king searching for immortality, wrestling with gods, and learning about a great flood? Yeah, that one. Without Ashurbanipal's collecting habit, we might only have bits and pieces of this foundational piece of world literature, but Gilgamesh was just the tip of the iceberg. The library had tablets detailing astronomical observations, which were super important for calendars and agriculture. It had medical texts describing diagnoses and treatments for various illnesses, some surprisingly astute, others a bit more magical. There were mathematical tablets, showing they were pretty good with numbers. There were also omen texts, which tried to predict the future by looking at everything from the flight of birds to the shape of a sheep's liver. Hey, it was a different time. So, what happened to this amazing place? Well, empires don't last forever. Around 612 BCE, Nineveh was sacked and burned by a coalition of enemies, including the Babylonians and Medes. The great city fell, and the palace housing the library was destroyed. But here's the ironic twist. The fires that ravaged the palace actually baked many of the clay tablets, making them harder and helping to preserve them. They lay buried under rubble for over 2,000 years until archaeologists started digging. Even though tens of thousands of tablets and fragments have been found, many are fragments. Large chunks are missing. Imagine reading only every 3rd page of your favorite book. That's what it's like for scholars trying to piece together these ancient texts. And here's the kicker. Historians believe that what's been found is only a fraction of what was originally there. Many tablets were likely shattered beyond recovery, Or perhaps there are sections of the library still undiscovered, or looted and lost over time. Think about what could still be missing. What if there were even older, more complete versions of Gilgamesh, with episodes we can't even dream of? What if there were detailed historical chronicles that could fill in huge gaps in our understanding of early civilizations, their politics, their daily lives? Imagine detailed astronomical records that could show us how they tracked the stars and planets with even greater precision than we currently know. Perhaps there were philosophical texts that could reveal entirely different ways ancient Mesopotamians thought about life, the universe, and everything. What if there were more extensive medical texts? Could they have contained observations or remedies that were lost to time, only to be rediscovered centuries later? Or what about agricultural techniques, engineering knowledge, or even forgotten languages and cultures that were documented on those tablets? The Assyrians conquered many peoples. Their library likely held information about those cultures now vanished. The loss isn't just about missing stories or facts. It's about losing a direct connection to the very dawn of recorded human thought. Ashurbanipal's library was a snapshot of a world just beginning to write down its deepest ideas. While we're incredibly lucky for what did survive the flames and the centuries, the thought of what didn't, what crumbled into dust or remains unread, is staggering. It's like having a conversation with the distant past, but with so many words garbled or silent. Number 6. The Mayan Codices. A universe of knowledge, deliberately turned to ash. Fast forward a couple of thousand years and hop across the Atlantic to the lush jungles of Mesoamerica. Here, the Maya civilization flourished for centuries, building incredible cities with towering pyramids, developing a super complex calendar system, and creating one of the most sophisticated writing systems in the ancient Americas. They were brilliant astronomers, mathematicians. They even had the concept of zero way before many other cultures, and meticulous record keepers. And how did they keep these records on codices? These weren't clay tablets or scrolls. They were screenfold books made from the inner bark of fig trees, coated with a fine white lime plaster and written on with intricate hieroglyphs and colorful illustrations. Imagine a beautifully painted, incredibly long comic book that folded up like an accordion, but instead of surprise, it detailed the movements of planets, predicted eclipses, recorded royal histories, outlined religious ceremonies, and maybe even contained poetry and stories. These codices were precious. They held the accumulated wisdom of generations, the keys to understanding their cosmos, their gods, their history, and their very identity. Scholars and priests would have consulted them for everything, from when to plant crops to how to conduct important rituals. Think of them as the Maya Internet Encyclopedia and sacred texts all rolled into one. So, where are all these amazing books today? Here's where the story takes a truly heartbreaking turn. When the Spanish conquistadors arrived in the 16th century, they weren't too interested in understanding Maya culture. They were interested in gold land and converting the Maya to Christianity. The Maya writing system, with its unfamiliar symbols and depictions of strange gods, was seen as demonic, as lies of the devil. One infamous figure in this cultural catastrophe was a Franciscan friar named Diego de Landa. In July 1562, in a town called Mani, in the Yucatan Peninsula, de Landa ordered a massive auto de fe, a public burning of heretical objects. He gathered up all the Maya codices he could find, along with thousands of cult images and other sacred items, and set them ablaze. He believed he was doing God's work, stamping out paganism. What he actually did was commit an act of irreversible cultural vandalism, wiping out centuries of knowledge in a single horrific bonfire. De Landa himself wrote about it, almost with a strange sort of pride mixed with a tiny bit of regret. We found a large number of books in these characters, and as they contained nothing in which there were not to be seen superstition and lies of the devil, we burned them all, which they regretted to an amazing degree, and which caused them much affliction. Much affliction is probably the understatement of the millennium. Imagine your entire cultural heritage, your science, your history, everything that made you who you are, going up in smoke. How many codices were destroyed? We don't know for sure, but it was likely hundreds, if not thousands. Today, only 4 partially preserved Maya codices are known to have survived this purge, probably because they were sent to Europe as curiosities before the big book burnings really got going. They're known as the Dresden Codex, the Madrid Codex, the Paris Codex, and the Grolier Codex, now called the Maya Codex of Mexico. That's it. 4 books to represent the entire literary and scientific output of a major civilization. Think about what was lost. The Dresden Codex, for example, is incredibly detailed about astronomy. It has tables for predicting eclipses and the movements of Venus with astonishing accuracy. If one surviving book shows this level of sophistication, what did the hundreds of others contain? Imagine if we had their complete historical records. We could understand the rise and fall of their great city-states, like Tikal and Palenque, in much greater detail, not just through archaeology, but through their own words. What if we had their medical texts? Did they have knowledge of medicinal plants from the rainforest that we're only now rediscovering? What about their mathematical treatises? We know they used a base 20 system and understood 0. What other mathematical concepts had they mastered? Could there have been codices detailing their engineering techniques for building those incredible pyramids and cities without metal tools, wheels for transport, or draft animals? What about their philosophy, their poetry, their myths beyond the few examples that survived in later post-conquest accounts written in the Latin alphabet? We have tantalizing glimpses, like the Popol Vuh, a collection of Maya creation stories written down after the conquest. But these were recorded after the original knowledge system was shattered. The destruction of the Maya codices wasn't just the loss of books. It was an attempt to erase a people's soul. It fundamentally altered how we understand this incredible civilization, forcing us to rely on stone inscriptions and pottery, trying to piece together a puzzle with most of the pieces deliberately thrown into the fire. What if that knowledge had survived? How would it have changed our perception of indigenous American cultures? What scientific or philosophical insights could we have gained much earlier? It's a loss that still echoes today, a stark reminder of how fragile knowledge can be in the face of intolerance. Number 5. The Library of Pergamum. The ambitious rival that got eclipsed, and maybe gifted away. Let's journey back to the ancient Mediterranean, to a city called Pergamum, located in what is now modern-day Turkey. Around the 3rd century BC, the rulers of Pergamum, the Attalid dynasty, decided they wanted their city to be a major cultural and intellectual hub, a shining beacon of Greek learning that could rival the already legendary Library of Alexandria. Talk about ambition. So, they started building. They constructed a magnificent acropolis, a temple to Athena, goddess of wisdom very fitting, and, crucially, a massive library. The goal was to gather as many texts as possible, just like Alexandria. Scholars were invited, scribes were hired, and a serious collection began to grow. Estimates suggest it might have housed around 200,000 scrolls at its peak. While not as enormous as Alexandria's reputed collection, that's still an absolutely staggering number of books for the ancient world. Imagine a city today building a library from scratch to compete with the Library of Congress. That's the kind of scale we're talking about. The Library of Pergamum became famous not just for its size, but also for an innovation born out of rivalry. The story goes that Ptolemy V of Egypt, feeling the heat from Pergamum's growing scholarly reputation, decided to cut off their supply of papyrus. Papyrus, made from a reed that grew abundantly in Egypt, was the main writing material of the time. No papyrus, no new scrolls. Right. Pergamines were resourceful. They are credited with perfecting, or at least popularizing, a new writing material, pergamena, charta, or parchment. This was made from treated animal skins, sheep, goat, or calf. Parchment was more durable than papyrus, could be written on both sides, and could even be scraped clean and reused. This innovation was a game changer for book production in the ancient and medieval world, and it all supposedly happened because of a book collecting feud. So what kind of knowledge was piling up in Pergamum? Like Alexandria, it would have focused heavily on Greek literature, philosophy, science, medicine, and history. The Attalid kings were patrons of the arts and sciences. They supported famous sculptors. The Dying Gaul statue is associated with Pergamum, and attracted scholars. Galen, one of the most influential physicians in all of history, whose theories dominated Western medicine for over 1,000 years, was born in Pergamum and likely studied there. The library would have had editions of Homer, plays by the great Greek tragedians and comedians, philosophical works by Plato and Aristotle and their followers, histories by Herodotus and Thucydides, and scientific treatises on mathematics, astronomy, and engineering. Probably also developed its own school of textual criticism and scholarship, just like Alexandria, with scholars comparing different versions of texts to create the most accurate editions. So, what happened to this amazing center of learning? This is where things get a bit murky. Pergamum, as an independent kingdom, didn't last forever. In 133 BC, its last king, Attalus III, died without an heir, and in a rather unusual move bequeathed his entire kingdom, including the library, to Rome. Under Roman rule, the library seems to have continued for a while, but its ultimate fate is a subject of debate. One very famous, though possibly romanticized story, comes from the Roman historian Plutarch. He wrote that Mark Antony, in a grand gesture of love, or perhaps political maneuvering, gifted the entire collection of 200,000 scrolls from Pergamum to Cleopatra to help restock the Library of Alexandria after one of its earlier fires. Possibly the one associated with Julius Caesar's visit. If this story is true, then Pergamon's collection wasn't entirely lost in a destructive sense, but rather absorbed into its bigger rival. However, this also means its distinct identity, and any unique texts or scholarly traditions it might have harbored could have been merged and eventually lost, along with Alexandria's own treasures in its later destructions. Other historians suggest the library might have simply declined gradually under Roman rule, with texts deteriorating, being dispersed, or not being actively maintained and copied. There's no single dramatic fire or invasion specifically blamed for wiping out Pergamum's library in the way we see with some others. But imagine if it had remained a vibrant, independent institution for longer, or if Antony hadn't, if the story is true, given it all away. What if it had served as a crucial backup, a second repository for ancient knowledge? Perhaps texts that were lost in Alexandria's eventual demise might have survived in Pergamum. Could it have preserved different scholarly interpretations or works from philosophical schools that were less favored in Alexandria? The ancient world was full of diverse schools of thought. Having multiple major libraries could have ensured that a wider range of these ideas survived. What if Pergamum had continued its focus on parchment, production, and innovation? Could that have led to different forms of bookmaking or preservation techniques? The loss of Pergamum as a distinct collection, whether through absorption or slow decline, represents the loss of a potential alternative, a different branch on the tree of knowledge. It's like having two master copies of a precious document, and then one gets lost or written over by the other. You're left wondering what unique annotations or variations that second copy might have held, insights that are now gone forever, making the intellectual landscape of the ancient world just a little bit less rich and varied. Number 4. The Imperial Library of Constantinople. The thousand-year guardian that finally fell. Imagine a library that acted as a bridge, a sturdy, thousand-year-long bridge, carrying the precious cargo of ancient Greek and Roman knowledge across the turbulent waters of the early Middle Ages. That was the Imperial Library of Constantinople. Founded perhaps as early as the 4th century CE by Emperor Constantine the Great, when he established his new capital, or more formally by his son Constantius II, this wasn't just any library. It was the main repository of learning for the entire Byzantine Empire. For over a millennium, while Western Europe was experiencing what some call the Dark Ages, a period of fragmentation, invasion, and significant loss of classical learning, Constantinople stood as a beacon of civilization. Emperors, scholars, and scribes consciously saw themselves as the inheritors and preservers of Greco-Roman culture. The Imperial Library was at the very heart of this mission. What did it hold? Estimates vary, but it likely contained hundreds of thousands of scrolls and later codices, the book format we know today. It wasn't just about quantity, though. It was about what they were preserving. They had the great works of Greek literature, Homer's epics, the plays of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. Yes, many of the ones we do have today survived because Byzantine scribes painstakingly copied them. They had histories by Herodotus, Thucydides, Polybius, and many Roman historians whose works were translated into Greek. They had philosophical texts from Plato, Aristotle, the Stoics, the Epicureans, and Neoplatonists. Scientific and mathematical works by Euclid, Archimedes, Ptolemy, the astronomer, not the Egyptian kings, and Galen were all carefully copied and studied. But it wasn't just a museum of old texts. Scholars in Constantinople produced commentaries, summaries, epitomes, and new works inspired by the classics. It was a living center of learning. They also collected important Christian theological writings, as Byzantium was a profoundly Christian empire. The library faced its share of challenges over the centuries. There were fires, earthquakes, and periods of imperial neglect. But it persisted, a testament to the value the Byzantines placed on their intellectual heritage. Scribes would meticulously copy aging papyrus scrolls onto more durable parchment codices, a crucial act of preservation. Without these generations of anonymous copyists, so much more of the ancient world's wisdom would have simply crumbled into dust. So, what happened to this incredible guardian of knowledge? The story of its demise is a tragic one, spread over a couple of devastating blows. The first major catastrophe came in 1204 CE during the Fourth Crusade. Now, this is one of history's truly bizarre and shameful episodes. Crusade that was originally intended to go to the Holy Land was diverted through a complex series of political and financial shenanigans to attack and sack Constantinople, a Christian city. Crusaders were brutal. They looted palaces and churches, melted down ancient statues for bronze, and, yes, they set fires that ravaged parts of the city. The Imperial Library, or at least significant parts of its collection, is believed to have suffered terribly during this pillage. Scrolls and codices were likely destroyed, stolen, or scattered. Imagine priceless, unique manuscripts being used as kindling or sold for pennies by soldiers who had no idea of their true worth. It was a cultural wound from which the library and the empire never fully recovered. The Byzantine Empire limped on for another 250 years, a shadow of its former self. The final death, knell for the imperial library and the empire itself, came in 1453, when Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks, led by Sultan Mehmed II. After a long siege, the city was conquered. While Mehmed II was a learned man himself, and later founded his own libraries, the chaos and destruction of the conquest inevitably led to further losses. Accounts from the time speak of books being burned, thrown into the sea, or sold off cheaply. Some texts were undoubtedly rescued by fleeing scholars who made their way to Italy, bringing with them Greek manuscripts that helped fuel the Renaissance in Western Europe. This is a crucial point. Much of the Greek classical heritage that did reach the West came via Byzantium. But the question is, how much didn't make it? How much was lost in 1204 and 1453? We know, for example, that we only have 7 plays by Aeschylus out of an estimated 90 he wrote. We have 7 of Sophocles, 120 plus plays, and 19 of Euripides, 90 plus. What masterpieces of drama were in the Imperial Library but never made it out? What if there were complete histories by authors whose works we only know in fragments, like Berossus's History of Babylonia or Manetho's History of Egypt, potentially preserved in Constantinople? Imagine if more scientific texts had survived. Could there have been Byzantine advancements or commentaries on ancient Greek science and technology that were lost? Perhaps treatises on engineering, medicine, or even Greek fire, that mysterious Byzantine incendiary weapon, whose full secrets might have been recorded. What about lost philosophical dialogues, epic poems, or unique Byzantine chronicles detailing their own rich thousand-year history in greater depth than what we currently possess? The Imperial Library of Constantinople was like a time capsule, carefully preserving the intellectual DNA of the ancient world. Its partial destruction and eventual fall meant that while some of that DNA was passed on, vital strands were broken. If it had survived intact, or if more of its contents had been disseminated before its end, the Renaissance might have started earlier or been even richer. Our understanding of the classical and medieval worlds would undoubtedly be more complete. It's a haunting thought. A library that did so much to save the past ultimately couldn't save all of itself. Number 3. Nalanda Mahavihara Library, Dharmaganya. The university city that burned for an agonizing 3 months? Let's travel to ancient India, to a place that was less a single library and more an entire university city. A sprawling campus of learning that was one of the wonders of the ancient world, Nalanda Mahavihara. Located in what is now Bihar, India, Nalanda wasn't just big, it was colossal. From around the 5th century CE to the 12th century CE, it was one of the greatest centers of Buddhist learning, attracting thousands of students and scholars, not just from all over India, but also from Tibet, China, Korea, Japan, and Southeast Asia. Think of it as the Harvard or Oxford of its time, but for Eastern philosophy and religion, and on an even grander scale. At the heart of Nalanda was its legendary library complex, known as Dharmaganya, which means Treasury of Truth or Mart of Dharma. This wasn't just one building. It was reportedly composed of 3 massive multi-story buildings with poetic names: Ratnasagra, Ocean of Jewels; Ratnodadi, Sea of Jewels; and Ratnaranjaka, Jewel Adorned. One of these buildings was said to be 9 stories high. Just try to imagine the sheer volume of manuscripts that could be housed in such structures. And what was inside? While Nalanda was primarily a center for Mahayana Buddhist studies, its curriculum was incredibly diverse. Students studied Buddhist scriptures and philosophy, of course, but also logic, grammar, linguistics, medicine, Ayurveda, astronomy, mathematics, art, and even Hindu Vedas and philosophy. It was a truly comprehensive institution. The library would have held tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, meticulously copied by hand onto palm leaves or birch bark. These weren't just any texts. They included rare Buddhist sutras, commentaries by generations of esteemed scholars, works on advanced logic that were famous throughout Asia, detailed medical treatises, astronomical calculations, and probably countless other subjects we can only guess at. Scholars at Nalanda were actively engaged in debate, research, and writing, so the library would have been constantly growing with new knowledge. Imagine the intellectual ferment, the discussions echoing through its halls, the candlelight flickering over scholars, poring over ancient wisdom and creating new insights. Chinese pilgrims like Xuanzang and Yaijing, who traveled to India in the 7th century CE, spent years studying at Nalanda and left detailed accounts of its vibrancy and the richness of its library. Xuanzang described thousands of monks and scholars, the strict discipline, the high level of debate, and the immense respect accorded to its teachers. He himself took hundreds of manuscripts back to China to translate, a monumental effort that hugely influenced the development of Buddhism in East Asia. So, what happened to this extraordinary center of learning, this ocean of jewels? The end was brutal and devastating. Around the year 1193 CE, some sources say 1200 CE, Nalanda was attacked by a Turco-Afghan military force led by Bakhtiar Khilji, a general of the Ghurid Sultanate. Khilji and his forces were on a campaign of conquest in eastern India. According to historical accounts, including the Persian chronicle Tabaqat-i-Nasiri, the monks at Nalanda were mistaken for Brahmins, Hindu priests, and many were slaughtered. The great university city was ransacked and put to the torch, and the library, the Dharmaganja. This is where the accounts become truly horrifying. Chronicles state that the library was so vast, with so many manuscripts, that it burned for 3 whole months. Just try to comprehend that. 3 months of irreplaceable knowledge, turning into smoke and ash. The sky must have been dark for miles around. It's a loss that is almost impossible to fully grasp. An entire intellectual ecosystem, built up over 7 centuries, wiped out in a conflagration that refused to die. What unique knowledge vanished in those flames? Think about the specific schools of Buddhist philosophy that flourished at Nalanda, like Madhyamaka and Yogacara. While we have some texts, many preserved in Tibetan or Chinese translations, thanks to scholars like Xuanzang, how many original Sanskrit treatises, commentaries, and debate records were lost? What nuances of thought? What entire philosophical lineages were extinguished? What about the secular subjects? Nalanda was known for its school of logic. Were there unique logical systems or texts that could have rivaled or complemented Aristotelian logic, which formed the basis of Western thought? India had a rich tradition of mathematics and astronomy. What advanced concepts, perhaps even early forms of calculus or more precise astronomical models, were recorded on those palm leaves? Ayurvedic medicine was highly developed. What medical knowledge, diagnostic techniques, or pharmaceutical recipes were lost to humanity forever? Imagine the historical records. Nalanda existed for 700 years. Its library must have contained chronicles, genealogies, and accounts of Indian history that are now completely gone, leaving huge gaps in our understanding of the period. What about literature, poetry, plays, or works on art and architecture? The destruction of Nalanda wasn't just a tragedy for India or for Buddhism. It was a tragedy for the world. It severed lines of intellectual transmission that had stretched across Asia. It's possible that scientific or philosophical ideas that could have spurred innovation or different modes of thinking in other parts of the world were snuffed out before they had a chance to spread. The sheer scale of the burning 3 long months symbolizes an almost unimaginable cultural holocaust. It's a chilling reminder that knowledge, no matter how profound or vast, can be utterly annihilated by violence and ignorance. Number 2. The House of Wisdom, Beit al-Hikmah, where the Islamic Golden Age shone brightest before the lights went out. Picture a vibrant, bustling city, the biggest in the world at the time, a true metropolis of culture, science, and innovation. This was Baghdad in the 8th to 13th centuries, the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, and the heart of what's known as the Islamic Golden Age. And at the very center of this intellectual explosion was an institution called the Beit al-Hikmah, or the House of Wisdom. Founded in the early 9th century, possibly by Caliph Harun al-Rashid of 1001 Nights fame, but more formally established and expanded by his son, Caliph al-Mahdi, the House of Wisdom was more than just a library. It was a major research and translation institute, a magnet for scholars from all over the known world. Muslims, Christians, Jews, even people from Persia and India. Al-Mamun was deeply passionate about knowledge and actively sponsored the collection and translation of scholarly works from Greek, Persian, Syriac, and Sanskrit into Arab. Imagine an army of translators working diligently to render the wisdom of Plato, Aristotle, Euclid, Ptolemy, Galen, Archimedes, and many others accessible to the Arabic-speaking world. This wasn't just rote copying. It was a dynamic process of absorption, commentary, and critique. The Abbasid caliphs poured enormous resources into this. Legend has it that translators were sometimes paid the weight of the books they translated in gold. The House of Wisdom quickly accumulated a vast collection of manuscripts on every conceivable subject: mathematics, astronomy, medicine, alchemy, the precursor to chemistry, optics, engineering, philosophy, logic, geography, and literature. It had observatories attached to it, where astronomers made new, more accurate observations of the heavens. It was a place of original research and groundbreaking discoveries. Think about some of the intellectual giants associated with or influenced by this environment. Al-Khwarizmi, often called the father of algebra, worked there. In fact, the word algebra comes from the title of his book, Kitab al-Jabr. He also introduced Hindu, Arabic numerals, the 0, 1, 2, 3 we use today, to the Islamic world, which then spread to Europe. The Banu Musa brothers, 3 brilliant engineers and mathematicians, translated ancient Greek mechanical devices and invented their own ingenious automata, trick fountains, self-trimming lamps, and even a programmable flute player, which sounds like an early form of robotics. In medicine, scholars like Al-Razi, Rhazes, and Ibn Sina, Avicenna synthesized Greek, Indian, and Persian medical knowledge and made their own significant contributions. Avicenna's Canon of Medicine became a standard medical textbook in Europe for centuries. In optics, Ibn al-Haytham, al-Haytham, conducted revolutionary experiments on light and vision, essentially developing the scientific method and laying the groundwork for later European scientists like Kepler and Descartes. The House of Wisdom and the broader intellectual environment of Baghdad was a crucible where ancient knowledge was not just preserved, but was actively built upon, leading to incredible advancements. This knowledge eventually trickled into Europe, often via Spain and Sicily, helping to spark the European Renaissance. So what happened to this shining beacon of learning? The end was cataclysmic. In 1258, the Mongol Empire, led by Hulagu Khan, a grandson of Genghis Khan, laid siege to Baghdad. After the city fell, a week of horrific destruction ensued. The Mongols, who at this point in their conquests were often not particularly interested in preserving the cultures they overran, engaged in widespread massacre and devastation. Accounts of what happened to the House of Wisdom and other libraries in Baghdad are horrifying. It's said that so many books were thrown into the Tigris River that the water ran black with ink for days, or even weeks. Some say the river was so choked with manuscripts that a horseman could ride across it. Palaces, mosques, hospitals, and libraries were looted and burned. The Grand Library of Baghdad, another major institution, was also destroyed. The intellectual heart of the Islamic world was ripped out. Estimates suggest hundreds of thousands of people were killed. The Abbasid Caliph was executed, ending the caliphate that had ruled for 5 centuries. Imagine the sheer scale of this loss. Countless original works by scholars of the Islamic Golden Age, treatises on mathematics that might have contained further developments beyond what we know of Al-Khwarizmi, astronomical charts of unparalleled accuracy, medical texts detailing for grids and cures or surgical techniques, philosophical conquires that could have offered unique perspectives, engineering diagrams for machines we can't even conceive of. All gone, turned to pulp in the Tigris or ashes in the fires. What if the House of Wisdom and the intellectual momentum of Baghdad had continued uninterrupted? Could the scientific revolution have begun in the Islamic world centuries before it did in Europe? What if the full corpus of translations and original research had been more completely and directly transmitted to Europe? Would the European Dark Ages have been shorter, or the Renaissance even more brilliant? We know about figures like Al-Khwarizmi or Ibn al-Haytham, often through the surviving works that did make it out, or through later commentaries. But what about their contemporaries, whose entire life's work vanished? What other fathers or mothers of various scientific disciplines are now anonymous, because their books fed the Tigris? The destruction of Baghdad in 1258 was a profound turning point. It wasn't just the end of a political dynasty. It was a devastating blow to global knowledge. While Islamic scholarship continued in other centers like Cairo, Samarkand, and Istanbul, the unique concentration of talent and resources in Baghdad, particularly at the House of Wisdom, was shattered. It's a sobering thought that a river running black with ink could symbolize such an immense intellectual void, a loss that undoubtedly reshaped the trajectory of human knowledge. Number 1. The Great Library of Alexandria. The legendary lost heart of all ancient knowledge. And here it is, the one you've probably been waiting for, the most famous lost library of them all. The name that has become synonymous with the tragic destruction of knowledge. The Great Library of Alexandria, located in Egypt, but a vibrant hub of Greek culture and intellect. Alexandria was founded by Alexander the Great around 331 BC. His successor in Egypt, Ptolemy I Soter, and his son Ptolemy II Philadelphus set about an incredibly ambitious project to collect all the knowledge of the world under one roof. Imagine that. Not just a national library, but a universal one. They wanted copies of every book, from every culture and language they could find. The Library of Alexandria, along with its sister institution, the Maushan, a temple of the Muses or research institute, became the undisputed intellectual capital of the Hellenistic world, and indeed much of the ancient world. How many scrolls did it hold? Estimates vary wildly, from 40,000 to a mind-boggling 700,000 at its peak. These weren't just any scrolls. They were often the original manuscripts of some of the greatest thinkers, writers, and scientists of antiquity. Agents of the Ptolemies scoured book markets. Ships docking in Alexandria were reportedly searched, and any books found were confiscated, copied by the library's scribes, and the copies returned to the owners. The rich, cheeky, but effective. They also undertook massive translation projects, most famously the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. The list of scholars who worked or studied at Alexandria reads like a who's who of ancient genius. Euclid, the father of geometry, whose Elements was the standard geometry textbook for over 2,000 years, likely taught there. Eratosthenes, the head librarian, famously calculated the circumference of the Earth with astonishing accuracy, using just sticks, shadows, and basic geometry. Archimedes, the brilliant mathematician, physicist, and engineer, studied in Alexandria and corresponded with scholars there. We might have had more of his incredible inventions like his death ray or advanced treatises on levers if his complete works possibly stored there had survived. Herophilus, often called the father of anatomy, performed human dissections, a rarity at the time, and made groundbreaking discoveries about the nervous system and the brain. Aristarchus of Samos, an astronomer working there, proposed a heliocentric model of the solar system, that the Earth revolves around the Sun nearly 1,800 years before Copernicus. Imagine if his full treatise, with all his calculations and arguments, had survived and been widely disseminated. Would the Copernican revolution have happened centuries earlier? The library held vast collections of Greek literature. Plays of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides were meticulously catalogued and edited. We only have a fraction of their output. The rest, perhaps hundreds of plays, were likely on Alexandria's shelves. What about Sappho's poetry, of which only fragments remain? Or the complete histories of Berossus on Babylonia, or Manetho on Egypt, written by native priests with access to ancient temple records? These could have revolutionized our understanding of those ancient civilizations. So what happened to this unparalleled treasure trove? Unlike some other libraries that suffered a single decisive blow, the destruction of the Library of Alexandria seems to have been a slow, agonizing decline, a death by 1,000 cuts over centuries. There wasn't just one culprit. One famous, though debated incident occurred in 48 BCE when Julius Caesar was in Alexandria. During a battle, he set fire to ships in the harbor, and the flames reportedly spread to parts of the city, possibly damaging a warehouse containing scrolls or even a section of the main library. But this was likely not a total destruction. The library seems to have continued, perhaps diminished, for centuries. It likely suffered during later Roman civil wars and imperial decrees. In 272 CE, Emperor Aurelian, while quelling a revolt, destroyed the Bruchian quarter where the main library was located. This was probably a more significant blow. The daughter library, located in the Serapeum Temple, might have survived longer. Then in 391 CE, Patriarch Theophilus of Alexandria, a zealous Christian acting under a decree from Emperor Theodosius I to destroy pagan temples, incited a mob to destroy the Serapeum. While the primary target was the temple itself, any remaining scrolls associated with it would have been at extreme risk, if not deliberately destroyed as pagan texts. The final and most controversial narrative attributes the library's ultimate end to the Arab conquest of Egypt in 642 CE. According to a later story, which many modern historians doubt, the Caliph Omar, when asked what to do with the books, supposedly said, "If these writings of the Greeks agree with the Book of God, they are useless and need not be preserved. If they disagree, they are pernicious and ought to be destroyed." The scrolls were then allegedly used to heat the city's bathhouses, taking 6 months to burn. While this story is dramatic, its historical accuracy is questionable, and it may have been a later invention. It's more likely that by 642 CE, what remained of the once great library was a pale shadow of its former glory, having already suffered from centuries of conflict, neglect, and religious intolerance. Regardless of the exact timeline and causes, the fact remains: the vast majority of the knowledge collected in Alexandria is lost to us. And the what-ifs are staggering. Imagine if Aristarchus's heliocentric model had become the accepted view. Would the scientific revolution have been kick-started over a millennium earlier? What if Archimedes' lost works on mechanics and engineering and survived? He reportedly created complex machines. Heron of Alexandria, who lived later, described a primitive steam engine, the Aeolipile, and various automata. Were these based on earlier, more advanced designs lost in the library? Could we have seen an industrial revolution in the ancient world, or at least a much faster technological development? What if the complete medical knowledge of Herophilus and other Alexandrian physicians had been preserved? Their understanding of anatomy and physiology was far ahead of its time. Would medical science have advanced more rapidly, saving countless lives through the centuries? Think of the lost literature. Hundreds of Greek plays, epic poems, philosophical treatises. From schools of thought that have vanished, detailed histories that could rewrite our understanding of the ancient world. What if we had the complete etymological dictionary of Philetas of Kos, or the comprehensive astronomical catalogue of Hipparchus, only parts of which survive through Ptolemy? The Library of Alexandria represented humanity's first grand attempt to gather and systematize all knowledge. Its loss wasn't just about burned scrolls. It was about shattered connections, forgotten discoveries, and paths not taken. It's a constant, aching reminder of how much of our past is shrouded in mystery, and how the survival of knowledge can fundamentally alter the course of history. The echoes of those lost scrolls still whisper to us, hinting at a world that might have been profoundly different, and perhaps, in some ways, far more advanced than we can easily imagine.